It was 6:14 in the morning, and I was sitting alone at my kitchen table with 18,750 pounds waiting beneath my finger. The transfer page was open on my tablet. The recipient's name meant nothing to me. The account was overseas. A warning box had appeared in the center of the screen, asking whether I was certain I knew the person receiving the money. I had already read it twice. Beside the tablet lay a folded sheet of paper with Rachel's bank details written in my own handwriting. At the bottom, underneath the reference number, she had added one sentence during our call the previous evening. "Once this is paid, I can finally come home to you." I looked at those words again. Come home. Not visit. Not pass through. Come home. The kitchen was still dark apart from the weak light above the cooker. Outside, the street was quiet, the pavements damp from overnight rain. The central heating had not yet come on, and my tea had already begun to cool beside me. My finger hovered over the confirmation button. Then my phone rang. Rachel. Her photograph filled the screen. Graying brown hair, gentle eyes, that warm, ordinary smile I had trusted for months. Before I could answer, another notification appeared above her name. A message from my daughter, Sophie. "Dad, please don't send anything. We found the woman in the photographs." For several seconds, I stared at both names. Rachel calling. Sophie warning me. One asking me to save her. The other asking me to stop. 6 months earlier, I would have laughed if anyone had suggested I could end up in that position. I had spent 35 years working as a council building inspector. My job had been to notice risk before it became danger. Cracks around window frames, poorly supported walls, missing signatures on safety certificates. Contractors who answered simple questions with complicated excuses. I checked paperwork. I challenged figures. I did not accept reassurance in place of evidence. People had called me cautious. Some had called me suspicious. I had always considered both descriptions compliments. Yet that morning, I was prepared to ignore an unfamiliar account, an international transfer, and a warning from my own bank because Rachel had become the first person in years who made me feel needed. Not tolerated. Not included out of duty. Needed. I answered the call. Rachel? At first, all I heard was breathing. Then a quiet sob. David, I'm sorry. Her voice sounded thin and frightened. What's happened? They've given me until this morning. Who has? The solicitor. The bank. Everyone. I don't know anymore. She began crying again. I closed my eyes. On the table, Sophie's message remained visible. We found the woman in the photographs. I should have asked Rachel what that meant. I should have demanded a video call. I should have rung Sophie before doing anything else. Instead, I said, try to slow down. I can't. You're not making sense. If the bond isn't paid before noon, they'll cancel the release. I'll lose the flight, the estate access, everything. Her voice dropped to a whisper, and I may never get back to Britain. I looked at the confirmation button again. You said this was the final payment. It is. You said that before. I know. There was a pause. Then she said the one thing I was weakest against. I thought you trusted me. The words did not sound accusing. They sounded hurt. That was worse. I picked up the phone properly and pressed it to my ear. Rachel, Sophie says she's found the woman in your photographs. Silence. Not surprise. Not confusion. Just silence. Then Rachel took a shaky breath. David, please listen to me before you believe whatever she's been told. My finger moved closer to the screen. If you don't send it this morning, she whispered, I may never get home to you. I looked from Rachel's name to my daughter's warning. The woman who had helped me through the worst loneliness of my life was begging me to trust her. My daughter was telling me that woman did not exist, and before the clock reached 6:15, I had to decide which of them I was about to betray. To understand why I nearly pressed that button, you have to understand what my life had become before Rachel appeared. I lived on a quiet residential street just outside Mansfield, in the same modest, semi-detached house Elaine and I had bought nearly 30 years earlier. The house was tidy. Too tidy, perhaps. There were no piles of washing, no shoes left by the door, no half-finished mugs beside the sofa. Everything stayed exactly where I put it because there was nobody else there to move it. When Elaine left, she took most of the photographs. Not all of them, just enough for the pale rectangles behind the frames to remain visible on the wallpaper. For months, I kept meaning to repaint the room. I never did. Those empty shapes became part of the house. Every morning, I woke at 6:30, even though I had nowhere to be. Years of work had trained my body too well. I would lie still for a moment, listening to the boiler click and the pipes settle, before remembering that the day belonged entirely to me. That sounds like freedom when you are working. In retirement, it can feel like something else. I made one mug of tea and switched on BBC Radio 4. The voices helped. They filled the kitchen without asking anything of me. After breakfast, I walked to the corner shop for a newspaper. The man behind the counter always said, "Morning, David," and I always replied, "Morning." That was usually the whole conversation. On Tuesdays, I went to the library. On Thursdays, I met Mark at a cafe near the market. On Fridays, I did my shopping at Tesco. The rest of the week arranged itself around small tasks: cleaning the gutters, checking the shed roof, cooking something simple, watching television while eating from a tray on my lap. My life wasn't tragic. That was what made it difficult to explain. Nothing terrible happened from one day to the next. There was simply less of everything. Less conversation, less laughter, less reason to look forward to the evening. The divorce itself had been quiet. There were no smashed plates. No shouting in the street. Elaine sat across from me at the dining table one Sunday afternoon and said she had been unhappy for years. Then she told me there was someone else. Not an affair, she insisted. Not in the way people imagined. She had grown close to a man from her walking group. They talked. He noticed things. He asked how she was and waited for the answer. I remember sitting there with my hands flat on the table, feeling as though I had missed an inspection fault in my own home. "How long?" I asked. "A while." "Do you love him?" She looked down. She looked down. "I don't know." That answer hurt more than yes would have. I signed the papers without contesting anything. She took most of the furniture because I could not bear another negotiation. People assumed I was being generous. The truth was, I was exhausted. What I lost was not the sofa or the sideboard. It was the knowledge that the woman beside me had already built another emotional life while I was still making tea for two. Sophie rang twice a week. She invited me to Sunday lunch often. Sometimes I went. Sometimes I invented a reason not to. Her house in Sheffield was always full of movement. Her husband answering emails. My grandson rushing upstairs. The washing machine turning. A joke at the table that everyone else understood before I did. I loved being there, but I also felt like a visitor. When I left, Sophie always hugged me and said, "Come again next week." I usually replied, "We'll see." She suggested local clubs, a walking group, a history society, even a men's shed project. "I'm perfectly all right," I told her. She never quite believed me. Neither did I. There were small habits that gave me away. I still bought the larger carton of milk. Sometimes I turned towards the hallway to say something to Elaine before remembering she no longer lived there. At night, I checked my phone even when I knew no one had messaged. One summer evening, I heard laughter from the neighboring garden. A family barbecue, by the sound of it. I sat in the dark and did not switch on the lamp. I did not want them to see me sitting there alone. A few days later, Mark and I were having coffee when he mentioned an online group for people over 60 who were divorced or widowed. I laughed. Not for me. "You haven't even looked. I know what these things are like. Do you?" He stirred his tea. "You don't have to marry anyone, David. You could just talk to somebody." That evening, his words came back to me. I found the group online and created the most basic profile possible. No photograph, no personal history, just my first name and one comment about how difficult it was learning to cook for one. For 3 days, nothing happened. Then, a private message appeared. Your comment about learning to cook for one made me smile. I'm still learning too. The sender was Rachel Morgan. I opened her profile. She looked ordinary, kind, real. And for the first time since Elaine left, someone had reached out to me without being asked. At the time, I thought I had been noticed. I did not yet understand that I might also have been identified. I nearly ignored Rachel's first message. Not because there was anything wrong with it. Quite the opposite. It was so ordinary that I assumed she'd sent it to the wrong person. Your comment about learning to cook for one made me smile. I'm still learning too. I read it twice before replying. I'm afraid my cooking has improved only because I've burnt enough meals to learn what not to do. Her answer came a few minutes later. Then perhaps we're both making progress. That was how it began. No flirting, no compliments, no dramatic declarations. Just two strangers talking about overcooked shepherd's pie and how difficult it was to judge portions when you were no longer cooking for a family. Rachel told me she had been widowed 6 years earlier. Her husband, Martin, had suffered a heart attack without warning. One minute they had been planning a weekend away. The next, she was arranging a funeral. I still expect to hear his key in the front door sometimes, she admitted one evening. I stared at the message before replying. I know exactly what you mean. Although my marriage had ended in divorce rather than bereavement, there were still moments when habit overruled reality. Sometimes I'd hear a car outside and instinctively think Elaine had forgotten something. The feeling disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived, but it still caught me by surprise. Rachel never compared our situations. She simply understood that endings, whatever form they took, left empty spaces. She explained that she had moved temporarily to Cyprus to care for her elderly aunt after the woman suffered a stroke. It was only supposed to be for a few months, she wrote. That was nearly 2 years ago. She missed ordinary things. Proper Yorkshire tea, cold autumn mornings, Sunday roasts, the sound of familiar accents in the supermarket. One afternoon, she sent me a photograph of a mug of tea balanced on a balcony overlooking the sea. The caption simply read, "Beautiful view, terrible tea." It made me laugh. I replied with a picture of the drizzle outside my kitchen window. "Excellent tea, terrible view." She answered almost immediately. "I'd swap with you tomorrow." Little details like that made her seem genuine. She never described a glamorous life abroad. She complained about expensive groceries, unreliable buses, and missing British biscuits. Everything sounded wonderfully ordinary. As the days passed, our messages became longer. Then she suggested we move to WhatsApp because, as she put it, it's easier than logging into the group all the time. I agreed without thinking much about it. Soon my phone would buzz first thing each morning. "Morning steady, David. Slept well?" I smiled the first time she called me that. My steady David. Nobody had given me an affectionate nickname in years. She began sending photographs every few days. A slice of toast with marmalade. A quiet stretch of sea. An elderly woman's hand resting beneath a knitted blanket. "My aunt's having a better day," she'd explain. There were voice messages too. Her accent sounded softly northern, comforting, never rushed. Sometimes she'd simply say, "Hope you're having a decent day," and somehow those few words lifted the whole afternoon. One evening, I mentioned my divorce properly for the first time. Not just that it had happened, but how it had happened. How neighbors had quietly stopped asking where Elaine was. How embarrassed I'd felt walking into the supermarket on my own after everyone knew she'd left. Rachel didn't criticize Elaine. She didn't tell me I deserved better. Instead, she wrote something I have never forgotten. Sometimes a marriage ends long before either person finds the courage to say it aloud. I sat looking at that sentence for several minutes. It didn't erase what had happened, but it removed something I'd been carrying: shame. She wasn't telling me I was blameless. She was telling me life was more complicated than blame. On the second anniversary of my divorce, before anyone else remembered the date, my phone buzzed. "What happened to you doesn't mean you're difficult to love." I read those words over and over again. Oddly enough, Sophie rang later that evening. We had a pleasant chat, but I didn't mention the anniversary. Or Rachel. Somehow, the woman hundreds of miles away had understood something I hadn't even said aloud. We began talking about all sorts of things: favorite television programs, old railway journeys, childhood holidays by the coast, how expensive butter had become, whether retirement was easier than working, what frightened us most about growing older. "I don't worry about dying," Rachel admitted one night. "I worry about becoming invisible first." I looked around my quiet sitting room. "I think I already know what that feels like." For a moment, neither of us sent another message. Then she replied, "Not to me, you aren't." A week later, I suggested we have a proper video call. She agreed immediately. At the arranged time, her face appeared for barely 3 seconds. I caught a glimpse of what looked like a woman sitting in a dimly lit room. Then the picture froze. The connection disappeared. A minute later, a voice message arrived. "I'm so sorry. The internet here is hopeless. I'll keep trying." There was genuine embarrassment in her voice. At least, that's how it sounded to me. I accepted the explanation because she hadn't refused. She had tried. Or so I believed. From that day on, she called me my steady David, almost every morning. One evening, after we'd been talking about how quiet my house felt, she said something that stayed with me long after we ended the call. "Perhaps one day it won't be silent at all." Then, almost casually, she mentioned that she had been thinking seriously about returning to Britain for good. "I've imagined meeting you at the railway station," she said. I smiled. "So, what's stopping you?" There was a short pause. Then she replied softly, "Only one thing." I had no idea that those 2 words would change the course of my life. After Rachel told me there was only one thing keeping her from returning to Britain, I found myself thinking about those words far more often than I cared to admit. I wanted to ask what it was. I also didn't want to sound impatient. For months, our friendship had grown naturally, because neither of us seemed to demand anything from the other. I didn't want to be the one who changed that. Our conversations settled into a rhythm that soon became part of my life. Every morning, before I even put the kettle on, there would be a message. "Morning, my steady David. Don't forget you've got the dentist today." Or, "Have you eaten breakfast yet?" No one had asked me questions like that since my marriage ended. Not because Sophie didn't care. She did. But she had her own family, her own responsibilities, her own life. Rachel somehow managed to make me feel as though my ordinary day mattered. When I mentioned that I'd caught a miserable winter cold, she rang 3 times that afternoon. "You sound dreadful," she said. "It's only a sniffle. Have you checked your temperature?" "I'll survive." "I'm sure you will, but humor me." I laughed. "You're worse than a GP." "I'll take that as a compliment." It felt strangely comforting to have somebody fuss over me. When I finally recovered, she celebrated as though I'd won a marathon. "See? I told you you'd be back on your feet." Little by little, I began changing things around the house. Nothing dramatic, just small improvements I'd ignored since the divorce. I replaced the old table lamp Elaine had taken with her because I'd grown tired of the empty space it had left. I started cooking proper meals instead of relying on ready-made pies. I spent an entire Saturday trimming the overgrown hedge and tidying the neglected flower beds. When I sent Rachel photographs of the garden, she replied almost immediately, "It looks loved again." That sentence stayed with me. Not the garden. Me. I even agreed to attend a local history talk with Mark, something I'd declined several times before. Afterwards, I told Rachel about an old railway line that had once connected villages across Nottinghamshire. "You sound happier," she said. "I think I am. I knew you would be." Without realizing it, I began linking that feeling directly to her, as though she had somehow rescued me from the life I'd been living. Looking back now, I understand that I had started healing before she arrived. She simply happened to be standing beside me while it happened, but at the time, I couldn't separate the two. Rachel gradually shared more about herself, not all at once. Just enough to make everything fit together. One evening, she sent a photograph of what she said was her British passport. Part of the number was covered by her thumb. "I don't like personal details floating around online," she explained. "Quite right," I replied. A few days later, she showed me what appeared to be a pension letter, then an old-school photograph from York, then a faded memorial card for her late husband. Nothing looked especially remarkable. If anything, the documents were almost boring. That was probably why I trusted them. I never thought to ask why each photograph was slightly blurred or why important details were always just out of focus. When I eventually told Sophie about Rachel, she sounded pleased. "I'm glad you've met someone nice." "So am I. Have you managed a proper video call yet?" "Almost. Almost. The internet where she is isn't brilliant." There was a short pause. "Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" "If anyone online ever asks you for money, you tell me first." I laughed. "Sophie, I spent 35 years inspecting council contracts." "I know. I'm not an idiot. I never said you were." I felt guilty the moment the words left my mouth. She wasn't questioning my intelligence. She was worrying about her father. That evening, I told Rachel about the conversation. Instead of sounding offended, she surprised me. "Sophie's absolutely right." "Really?" "Of course. If I were her, I'd be protective too." Her answer impressed me. She wasn't trying to turn me against my daughter. "If I ever meet Sophie," Rachel added gently, "I hope she'll see I'd never come between the two of you." It was exactly what I wanted to hear. A week later, a parcel arrived. Inside was a paperback novel I'd once mentioned enjoying, a handwritten card, and a pressed forget-me-not flower tucked carefully between the pages. The card read, "For the man who reminded me, life may still have another chapter." I placed it on the mantelpiece, where I could see it every day. No expensive gift could have meant more. As winter turned toward spring, we began talking about finally meeting. Nothing extravagant. A coffee in York. Perhaps a weekend in the Peak District later in the year. Rachel explained that once her late aunt's apartment was officially settled, she'd have around £46,000 from the sale. "The probate's taking forever," she sighed. "But when it's finished, I'll be completely free." She even offered to send me £200 towards booking a hotel for our first weekend away. When the transfer supposedly failed, she laughed at her own bad luck. "My bank account seems determined to embarrass me." "Don't worry about it," I said. "We'll sort everything when you're home." It never occurred to me that the failed payment had achieved something more valuable than sending the money ever could. It convinced me she'd intended to contribute. One quiet evening, after we'd been talking for almost 2 hours, Rachel became unusually quiet. I never thought I'd care about anyone again. Neither did I. For a moment, I couldn't find the words. Then I answered honestly, nor did I. Neither of us said the word love. We didn't need to. The silence between us said enough. The following morning, I waited for her usual message. Nothing came. By lunchtime, I had begun checking my phone every few minutes. Late that evening, a single text finally appeared. "Something has happened with my aunt's estate. I'm frightened, David." As I read those words, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I had no way of knowing whether I was about to help the woman I cared about, or step into the trap that had been waiting for me from the very beginning. Rachel did not call that evening. She sent only short messages. "The hospital has confirmed it." Then, "My aunt passed away early this morning." I sat at the kitchen table with my phone in both hands, trying to think of something useful to say. I had never met her aunt. I did not even know the woman's first name. Yet I understood the emptiness that follows a death, and I knew there were moments when words could sound almost insulting. So I wrote, "I'm here. You don't have to explain anything tonight." Rachel replied with a broken heart symbol. For the next 2 days, she seemed exhausted. She told me there were medical bills, forms, and officials asking questions she could barely understand. The apartment could not be released until the estate was settled. She did not mention money. That reassured me more than it should have. Whenever I asked what she needed, she replied, "Just stay with me." So I did. I kept my phone beside me while I cooked, while I watched television, and even while I tried to sleep. On the third evening, Rachel said the apartment sale had been delayed. I frowned at the screen. I remembered her telling me months earlier that the property had already been sold. I read back through several old messages until I found the sentence. "Once the apartment sale completes, I'll have enough to start again in Britain." When she rang, I asked carefully, "I thought you said there was already a buyer." "There is, but now you're saying it can't be sold." "No, David. I said the buyer had agreed in principle." Her answer came quickly. "The legal transfer can't happen until the debts are cleared." Oh, I probably explained it badly before. She sounded tired rather than defensive. I felt ashamed for questioning her while she was grieving. "I'm sorry. You've nothing to apologize for." She gave a small sigh. "Everything's become such a mess." The following afternoon, I asked whether we could have a video call. "Just for a minute," I said. "I'd like to see that you're all right. I'm at the hospital." "Tonight then?" "I may be at the solicitor's office." The next day, she said the Wi-Fi where she was staying had stopped working. Instead, she sent me a photograph of an empty hospital corridor, white walls, plastic chairs, a trolley beside a closed door. Nothing in the picture showed Rachel, Cyprus, or even which hospital it was. At the time, I saw only proof that she was telling the truth. Sophie rang that evening. I mentioned that Rachel was having difficulties with her aunt's estate, but did not give details. "Has she asked you for anything?" Sophie said. "No." "Money?" "I've just said no." There was a pause. "I'm only checking." After the call, I told Rachel that Sophie remained cautious. Rachel became very quiet. "I understand." "She's protective." "She should be." Then, after a moment, she added, "I do worry she'll think I'm trying to replace her mother." "Elaine isn't her mother any more than you are." "I know. I only mean, families can find later life relationships difficult." She spoke gently, as though the thought embarrassed her. "Sometimes adult children are frightened that someone new will change everything." "What do you mean?" "Nothing. Forget I said it." But she did not leave it there. "I've heard of families destroying perfectly good relationships because they were worried about inheritance." I felt a flicker of irritation. Sophie isn't like that. I'm sure she isn't. Her agreement came too easily. The suggestion remained after the conversation ended. 2 days later, Rachel sent me a letter from the estate solicitor. According to the document, she had 7 days to pay an administrative release fee. If she missed the deadline, further penalties could be added, and her temporary accommodation might no longer be covered. I read the letter several times. The wording felt awkward. The solicitor used an ordinary free email address. The amount was written in pounds rather than euros. The signature at the bottom looked slightly blurred, as though it had been copied from somewhere else. My old professional instincts began quietly listing faults. Poor phrasing. Unverifiable contact details. Artificial urgency. I nearly told Rachel the document did not look right. Then she rang. Her voice sounded drained. "I haven't slept properly in days." "Why can't the solicitor take the fee from the estate? Local law won't allow it." "Are you certain? Do you think I haven't asked?" The hurt in her voice stopped me. "I'm sorry." "No? You're right to question it." She began crying softly. I just wish Martin were here. He'd know what to do. The next Thursday, I showed Mark none of the documents, but I casually asked whether probate abroad could involve fees paid in advance. He stopped stirring his coffee. Has she asked you for money? No. David. She hasn't. He leaned towards me. The moment she does, you walk away. His bluntness annoyed me. You don't know her. No, and neither do you. I left the cafe earlier than usual. That night, Rachel disappeared. 12 hours passed without a message. When she finally called, she said she had spent the night in a hospital waiting room after suffering chest pains. I kept thinking, she whispered, that I might die before I ever met you. Every doubt I had been holding collapsed beneath those words. Then she told me she had found a way to return to Britain immediately. There was only one problem. She needed my help for 48 hours. I'll explain everything tonight, she promised. As I waited for the call, one question remained. How much would she ask for? And after everything she had made me feel, would I still be able to say no? Rachel rang just after 8 that evening. I could tell from the first sound of her voice that she had been crying. David, I'm so ashamed. You don't have to be ashamed with me. I never wanted you involved in any of this. I leaned back in my chair, the phone pressed against my ear. Just tell me what's happened. She took a slow, shaky breath. The solicitor finally explained everything. And? The estate can't be released until several outstanding costs are settled. I thought those would come out of the sale. So did I. Her voice cracked again. Apparently, they have to be paid first. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then she said quietly, I've been trying to think of another solution all day. What sort of costs? There are administrative fees, accommodation while everything is processed, my replacement flight, transport back to the airport. She stopped herself. I'm sorry. You don't need to hear all this. I asked. I shouldn't have answered. She was careful. Looking back, I realized she never rushed towards the subject of money. She circled around it, allowing me to arrive there myself. I've contacted everyone I can think of, she continued. No luck? My cousins haven't replied. What about friends? I don't want them knowing I'm in this situation. Then came a long silence. Not uncomfortable. Heavy. I'll sort something out, she whispered eventually. You don't sound convinced. I'm not. Another pause. Then, almost reluctantly, she added, It's about £2,400. The figure caught me by surprise. It wasn't a fortune, nor was it small enough to ignore. It sat in that uncomfortable middle ground where helping someone felt entirely possible. Before I could answer, Rachel spoke again. Please don't take it from money you need. I have savings. I couldn't let you do that. You haven't asked me. No, you've just told me what's happened. I never wanted you to feel responsible. I stood and walked slowly into the conservatory. Rain tapped gently against the glass roof. For years I had been careful with money. Every overtime shift, every holiday we postponed, every sensible decision Elaine and I had made had eventually become the savings account sitting quietly in my bank. Helping someone you loved didn't feel reckless. It felt exactly like what you were supposed to do. If I transfer it, I asked, will that solve everything? It should. You'll be able to come home? Yes. And you'll pay me back once the estate's released? I promise. She sounded so relieved that I almost felt guilty for taking so long. I'll do it tomorrow morning. For a second, she said nothing. Then, I heard her crying again. Not loudly, just quiet sobs of relief. I don't know what I've done to deserve you. You don't have to deserve me. I'll repay every penny within 5 working days. I believe you. And then, she laughed through the tears. You'll finally meet me. The following morning, I transferred the money. I remember checking the account number twice, the payment reference once, then pressing confirm. When the receipt appeared, I felt oddly peaceful. I wasn't losing money. I was helping the woman who had helped me. That afternoon, Rachel sent me what appeared to be a payment receipt from the solicitor. It looked official enough. She followed it with a voice message. "My steady David." She paused, trying to compose herself. "You've given me something I thought I'd lost." "What?" "Hope." I listened to that message several times. For the next 2 days, she seemed lighter. She spoke about arriving in Britain, about drinking proper tea, about walking through York together before taking the train to Nottinghamshire. The future felt close enough to touch. Then, on the morning she was supposed to fly, my phone rang before breakfast. "I've been stopped." "What do you mean?" "They've detained me at the airport." My stomach tightened. Why? The inheritance tax certificate. I thought everything had been settled. So did I. She sounded exhausted. "They say one document is still missing." "What happens now?" "I don't know." A long silence followed. Then she whispered, "They've told me it can all be resolved, but it'll cost another £6,800. I sat down heavily. "Rachel?" "No." Her voice became firm for the first time. "I won't ask you." "I wasn't. I've already taken enough from you. So what will you do?" "I'll stay here." "Where?" "Probably the airport." "For how long?" "I honestly don't know." The thought of her sitting alone on an airport bench while I did nothing was unbearable. "I'll help?" "No. I mean it. I can't let you. You aren't letting me." I looked out through the kitchen window. "I've made my decision." She protested again. Only briefly. Then, with obvious reluctance, accepted. By the following afternoon, the second payment had gone. 2 days later, I drove to Manchester Airport, carrying a small bunch of white lilies. I stood beside the arrivals barrier, watching passengers stream through the doors. Families embraced. Children ran into grandparents' arms. Taxi drivers lifted handwritten signs. The arrivals board changed from "landed" to "bags delivered." Then to nothing at all. Rachel never appeared. A message finally arrived. "I'm so sorry. They removed me from the flight minutes before boarding. The final document still wasn't processed." I stood there until the arrivals hall had almost emptied. Then I quietly dropped the flowers into a rubbish bin outside the terminal before beginning the long drive home. I never told Sophie where I'd been. When Rachel called that night, she sounded heartbroken. "You must think I'm a terrible woman." "I don't. I've ruined everything. We'll sort it." 2 mornings later, another message arrived. She claimed there was now one final solution. A refundable financial bond. The amount was £18,750. Once paid, she would recover the estate, repay every penny I'd already sent, and finally come home. I logged into my savings account. The balance looked smaller than I remembered. Rachel's bank details appeared moments later. The transfer had to reach the account before midday. As I stared at the figures on the screen, one question kept returning. Was I about to save the future we'd planned together? Or lose nearly £28,000 because I could no longer bear the thought of losing her? At 6:14 that morning, I was still staring at the transfer screen. £18,750. The cursor hovered over the blue button marked Confirm Payment. My hands would not move. For the first time since Rachel had entered my life, my instincts and my emotions were pulling in opposite directions. Then my mobile rang. It was Sophie. I almost let it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. "Morning." She sounded unusually serious. "Dad, where are you?" "At home." "Are you on your computer?" I looked at the banking page. "Why?" There was a pause. "Dad, please tell me you haven't sent any more money." The words hit me like cold water. You have, haven't you? I've helped Rachel a couple of times." "How much?" I couldn't answer immediately. I asked how much. Just enough to help her come home. Dad, her voice broke. How much? About 9,000. There was silence. Not angry silence. The sort that comes when someone is trying desperately not to panic. Then she asked the question I had been avoiding myself. Have you actually met her? No. Video called properly? The connection. Dad. I stopped talking. She took a slow breath. I need you to listen to me for 2 minutes. I'm listening. I've spent the last 3 evenings looking into Rachel. My heart began beating faster. What do you mean? I wasn't trying to interfere. I know. I was worried. She hesitated. I searched the photographs she'd sent you. I frowned. Searched them? Reverse image search. I had heard the expression before, but never paid much attention to it. What happened? The woman in those pictures exists. Relief flooded through me. There you are. But she isn't Rachel. Everything inside me seemed to stop. What? She's a physiotherapist from Leeds. That's impossible. I found her professional website. I stood so quickly that my chair tipped backwards onto the kitchen floor. No. Dad. The photographs. They've been stolen. I couldn't speak. Sophie continued gently. I also searched the passport picture you showed me. You never saw the whole passport. I didn't need to. The layout is wrong. What? It isn't a current British passport design. I felt my mouth go dry. Rachel said she'd covered part of it for privacy. I know. And the solicitor's letter? I sent it to a friend who works in legal administration. Another pause. He said no genuine solicitor here would write a letter like that. The room suddenly felt too warm. I looked at Rachel's latest message, still glowing on my computer screen. Please send it before midday. Then everything will finally be over. My breathing became shallow. No. Dad, I've spoken to her nearly every day. I know. She cried. I know. She remembered things I'd told her months earlier. I know. Tears blurred my vision. People don't do that if they're pretending. Sophie didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was full of compassion rather than triumph. Professional fraudsters do. The sentence landed harder than anything else she had said. Professional. Not accidental. Not desperate. Professional. I've made her part of my life. I know. I've trusted her. I know. I couldn't finish the sentence. After everything Elaine's departure had done to my confidence, Rachel had slowly rebuilt it. Or so I'd believed. Dad? Sophie's voice softened even further. There's one more thing. What? I rang the number listed for the hospital in Cyprus. You what? There isn't one. What do you mean? No hospital with that name exists. I closed my eyes. Every photograph, every excuse, every failed video call, every canceled flight, every tear. My mind began replaying months of conversations, but now every memory carried a different meaning. Then my phone vibrated. Rachel, calling. I stared at the screen. Sophie whispered, "Please don't tell her we've spoken." What do I do? Answer. I pressed accept. David? Rachel sounded breathless. Have you done the transfer? I swallowed. Not yet. Relief filled her voice. Thank goodness. I was terrified you'd miss the deadline. I'm just checking something first. There was the slightest hesitation. What do you mean? The airport bond. Yes? I wondered whether I could speak directly to the solicitor. Silence. Only for 2 seconds. But after months of talking to Rachel, I recognized something I had never heard before. Calculation. Then her warm voice returned. They're in court this morning. I could wait. You can't. Why not? The deadline expires at midday. I glanced at the clock. 10:47 a.m. Plenty of time. Yet suddenly, everything felt rushed. Urgent. Exactly as every payment had been. Rachel spoke again. David. Yes? Do you trust me? 6 months earlier, I would have answered without thinking. Now, for the first time, I didn't know. Before I could reply, another call appeared on the screen. Helen Patel, Mansfield Building Society. The advisor who had helped manage my savings for nearly 15 years. I stared at both names. Rachel. Helen. One promised the future. The other represented everything solid and real. I had only seconds to decide which call to answer first, and deep inside, something was telling me that whichever choice I made next would change the rest of my life forever. For one frozen moment, I simply stared at the two names on my phone. Rachel. Helen Patel. It felt as though my entire future had been reduced to 2 buttons. Rachel was still waiting. David? I swallowed. Can you hold on for a moment? I don't understand. I've another call coming through. It can wait. Her answer came far too quickly. It might be important. So is this. For the first time since I'd known her, there was urgency in her voice that sounded less like fear and more like pressure. Please, she whispered, just send the transfer first. That was the moment something shifted inside me. Not because of what she said, because of what she didn't. She hadn't asked who was calling. She hadn't asked whether I was all right. She cared only about the money. I'll ring you back. Before she could protest again, I ended the call. Then I answered Helen. Good morning, David. Her calm, familiar voice immediately steadied me. I'm sorry to bother you. You never bother me. I've noticed a payment request scheduled from your online banking this morning. My heart skipped. You can see that? We monitor unusually large transactions, especially when they're outside a customer's normal pattern. I looked back at the computer screen. The transfer was still waiting for my approval. I just wanted to check, Helen continued, whether you've personally verified the recipient. I hesitated. What happens if I haven't? There was a brief silence. Then she asked gently, has someone you've only met online asked you to send this money? The question was so precise that it almost frightened me. How did you know? Because I've had 3 very similar conversations this year. I closed my eyes. Oh, I can't tell you what to do with your own money. I know. But I'd strongly recommend you don't send anything until you've spoken to our fraud prevention team. I glanced again at Rachel's last message. Please hurry. Helen seemed to sense my hesitation. David. Yes? If this is genuine, waiting a few hours won't change that. Those words landed with remarkable clarity. If it was genuine, waiting would make no difference. Only a fraud depended on panic. I'd like you to meet someone, Helen said. Our fraud specialist is available now if you can come into the branch. I can be there in 20 minutes. I'll make sure she's waiting. I closed the banking page without completing the transfer. The moment I did, another WhatsApp message arrived. Have you sent it? I didn't reply. Another appeared 30 seconds later. David? Then another. Please answer. By the time I reached Mansfield Building Society, there were 12 unread messages. Rachel had never sent messages like that before. Never. Helen greeted me personally and led me into a small meeting room where another advisor introduced himself as Daniel. He didn't begin by accusing anyone. He simply asked me to tell the story from the beginning. I spoke for nearly an hour. How we'd met, the failed video calls, the canceled flights, the solicitor, the hospital, the airport, the payments. Neither Helen nor Daniel interrupted. They just listened. When I finally stopped, Daniel quietly turned his computer screen towards me. I'd like to show you something. It was a government warning page about romance fraud. I began reading. Victim recently divorced or widowed. Daily messages. Emotional dependence. Plans to meet repeatedly canceled. Medical emergencies. Inheritance delays. Urgent requests. Promises of repayment. Every sentence felt like another brick being laid on my chest. Then Daniel opened another document. This one contained anonymized case summaries. A retired teacher, a widower from Kent, an engineer from Birmingham, different names, different countries. The same story, almost word for word. I felt physically sick. I wasn't chosen because she loved me. No, I was chosen because I fit a pattern. Daniel nodded gently. Professional criminal groups spend months building trust. Months. They're patient. I stared at the table. So none of it was real. Daniel paused before answering. We don't know who was actually sending the messages. What do you mean? Sometimes several people operate the same account. The thought was almost unbearable. The woman whose voice had comforted me after lonely evenings might never have existed at all. Helen placed a box of tissues beside me. Not dramatically, quietly, as though she'd done it many times before. I feel so stupid. She shook her head. No, I ignored every warning. You were manipulated. I still sent the money, because someone deliberately earned your trust. Tears came before I realized I was crying. Not because of the money, because I suddenly understood that every deeply personal conversation, every memory, every confession, had probably been carefully collected to make the next lie more convincing. Daniel leaned forward. David. I looked up. If you agree, we'd like to contact the police immediately. I nodded. Will I get my money back? I honestly don't know. It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was the first completely honest answer I'd heard in months. Just then my phone vibrated again. Rachel, calling. Then another message. If you love me, please trust me one last time. Daniel looked at me. You don't have to answer. I stared at the screen for several long seconds. Then, instead of blocking the number, I handed my phone across the table. If there's any chance of stopping whoever's behind this, I said quietly, use whatever you need. As Daniel accepted the phone and contacted the police's fraud investigation team, I realized the story wasn't over. In many ways, it had only just begun. The police asked me not to block Rachel. Instead, they wanted everything to continue exactly as before. Every message, every missed call, every promise, every excuse. If they're part of an organized fraud network, Detective Sergeant Lewis explained, they'll often stay in contact for days or even weeks if they believe the victim is still willing to pay. I never imagined that the most difficult part of the investigation would be pretending I still believed her. Daniel from the bank sat beside me while I sent the first message. I'm sorry I disappeared. The bank delayed the transfer because of the amount. Less than a minute later, Rachel replied, I was terrified something had happened to you. 6 months earlier, those words would have filled me with warmth. Now I looked at them differently. She hadn't asked whether I was safe. She hadn't asked whether I was unwell. She wanted to know about the money. The detective suggested another reply. They've asked questions I wasn't expecting. Rachel began typing almost immediately. Don't tell them anything about me. The detective quietly pointed at the screen. There. What? That's fear. Fear of what? Exposure. Until then, I'd never realized how quickly her tone changed whenever someone in authority entered the conversation. Rachel continued. Banks don't understand international inheritance law. Another message followed. If they freeze the transfer, everything we've worked for disappears. Everything we've worked for. The words almost made me laugh. She had spent months convincing me we were building a future together. Now she was using that imagined future as leverage. Detective Lewis asked permission to take copies of every conversation. There were thousands of messages, voice recordings, photographs, documents, flight confirmations, hospital letters, receipts. Looking through them together felt like watching my own life through someone else's eyes. The detective paused at one photograph Rachel had sent nearly 4 months earlier. It showed a cup of tea beside a balcony overlooking the sea. "Have you still got the original file?" "I think so. Daniel found it on my phone." The detective smiled faintly. "This is useful." "Why?" "The image wasn't taken in Cyprus." "It wasn't?" He enlarged the file. The embedded location data was removed. "So?" "But whoever edited it forgot something else." He pointed towards a reflection in the window. A road sign. Tiny, almost invisible. The detective zoomed in until the lettering became readable. It wasn't Greek. It wasn't English. It appeared to be Croatian. I stared at the photograph. So even this was probably taken somewhere entirely different. One by one, every certainty disappeared. The hospital corridor, the passport, the solicitor's letter, the airport boarding pass, the pension statement. Every single document contained tiny inconsistencies that I had overlooked because I trusted the person sending them. Late that afternoon, another message arrived. "David, please answer the phone." The detective nodded. "This time, answer." I put the call on speaker. Rachel sounded frightened. Genuinely frightened, I thought for a split second. Then I reminded myself that I had believed that voice for months. "David? I'm here. Have you sorted the bank?" "They've delayed everything." "Oh no," she breathed sharply. "They can't do that." "They're asking questions." "What sort of questions?" "They want proof." Silence. Then, "Tell them the money is for home renovations." I looked at the detective. He slowly shook his head. "My kitchen?" I asked. "Yes. But it's going overseas." Another pause. "Tell them you're buying property." "The paperwork says it's a personal transfer." She became impatient. "David, banks don't check these things." The detective quietly wrote 3 words on his notebook and turned it towards me. "She's improvising." I realized he was right. For months, Rachel had always seemed prepared. Now every answer sounded rushed, inconsistent, desperate. "Rachel." "Yes? Can you help me understand something?" "Anything?" "What hospital treated your aunt?" Silence. Then she laughed nervously. "Why are you asking that now?" "I was just thinking about her." Another pause. "You wouldn't know it." "I'd like to." I can't remember how it's pronounced." The detective raised his eyebrows. The woman who supposedly spent nearly 2 years caring for her aunt couldn't remember the hospital's name. I felt something inside me finally break. Not dramatically, quietly, like a rope that had been under tension for too long. "Rachel." "Yes?" "I searched your photographs." "Nothing." "I know who the real woman is." Complete silence. For almost 10 seconds. Then the line went dead. No goodbye. No explanation. Nothing. The detective immediately began recording the time. "Don't call back," he said. I wasn't going to. 5 minutes later, another message arrived. "You've made a terrible mistake." Then another. "Someone is trying to turn you against me." Then another. "Please don't throw away what we have." I read every word without replying. Half an hour later, the tone changed completely. "If you don't send the money today, everything you've already paid will be lost forever." There it was. The final mask had slipped. No more tenderness. No more memories. No more dreams of Yorkshire tea or walks together through the Peak District. Only pressure. Only fear. Only money. That evening, Detective Lewis rang with an update. The receiving account I'd transferred money into had already been emptied. The funds had moved through several overseas accounts within hours of arriving. Recovering them would be difficult, possibly impossible. "I wish I had better news," he said. After we ended the call, I sat alone in the kitchen. The house felt painfully quiet again. But this silence was different. Months earlier, I had feared being alone. Now I realized something far worse. I had been lonely enough to mistake careful manipulation for genuine love. A gentle knock sounded at the front door. When I opened it, Sophie was standing there. Without saying a single word, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me. For the first time since all of this had begun, I allowed myself to stop pretending I was all right. People often ask me what happened to Rachel. The truthful answer is this: I don't know, and I probably never will. The police continued their investigation for several months. Every few weeks, Detective Sergeant Lewis rang with an update. Most of the news was disappointing. The bank accounts I'd paid into had been opened using stolen identities. The money had been transferred through several countries within hours. The telephone numbers were discarded. The email addresses disappeared. The website linked to the fake solicitor vanished overnight. It was as though the entire person I had known had dissolved into thin air. One afternoon, Detective Lewis invited Sophie and me to the station. "I wanted to tell you this face to face," he said. "We've linked your case to a larger international investigation." "So you found them?" "We've identified part of the network." "And Rachel?" He shook his head gently. "We don't believe Rachel was her real name. What about the woman whose photographs were used? We spoke to her." I looked up. She had no idea. The real woman was a physiotherapist from Leeds. She had discovered months earlier that strangers were stealing photographs from her social media accounts. Mine was not the first fraud connected to her images. Nor, sadly, was it the last. Hearing that somehow hurt even more. Not because I had expected Rachel to be real, but because the smiling face I had trusted had belonged to another innocent victim. The investigation eventually recovered a small amount of money from one frozen account. £3,200, out of nearly 28,000. When Helen from the Building Society rang to tell me, she apologized as though the loss were somehow her fault. "It isn't much." "No, I'm sorry. So am I." But I realized something surprising after we ended the call. Months earlier, I would have measured the outcome entirely by the money. Now, I didn't. The greatest loss had never been financial. It had been trust. That was much harder to rebuild. For several weeks, I barely left the house. I ignored invitations from Mark. I stopped answering calls unless Sophie rang. Every WhatsApp notification made my stomach tighten. One evening, I almost deleted every photograph from my phone. Instead, I did something different. I sat at the kitchen table and listened again to Rachel's very first voice message. "Hope you're having a decent day." I expected to feel heartbreak. Instead, I heard something else. Carefully controlled warmth. Perfect timing. Not a single hesitation. Professional. Months earlier, I had heard kindness. Now I heard performance. I deleted the recording. Then the next one. And the next. One by one, every message disappeared. When I finally emptied the folder, I felt strangely lighter. Not healed, but no longer trapped inside a conversation that had never truly existed. A fortnight later, Mark arrived without warning, carrying 2 bacon sandwiches and a flask of tea. "You weren't answering." "I know." So I decided not to ask permission. He looked around the kitchen. "You've been hiding." "I suppose I have." He handed me a sandwich. "I should have listened to you." He shrugged. "You listened when it mattered. I nearly sent another 18,000. But you didn't." I smiled faintly. "No. You know what that means." "What?" "You beat them." "I lost £28,000. You kept the rest of your life." I had never thought about it that way. A few days later, Helen invited me to speak at a small fraud awareness meeting organized by the Building Society. My first instinct was to refuse. I don't want people knowing how foolish I've been. Helen looked at me kindly. "You aren't the person who should feel embarrassed." I almost declined anyway. Then Sophie quietly squeezed my hand beneath the table. So I agreed. About 30 people attended, mostly retired couples, widowers, widows, people very much like me. When I finished telling my story, Nobody laughed. Nobody judged. Instead, an elderly gentleman stood up. "My wife died 4 years ago," he said. "I've been talking to someone online for 3 months." The room became completely silent. He looked directly at me. "I think I needed to hear your story today." After the meeting, 3 more people stayed behind to ask questions. One woman admitted she had already transferred money overseas. Another gentleman confessed he was too embarrassed to tell his children about an online relationship. For the first time since everything had happened, I realized my experience might protect someone else. That thought gave the whole painful chapter a different meaning. Life did not suddenly become perfect. There were still quiet evenings, still empty chairs, still moments when loneliness crept into the house uninvited. But I stopped believing that loneliness was something to be hidden. I accepted more of Sophie's invitations. I joined Mark's local walking group. I even learned how to use video calls properly with my grandson, who laughed patiently whenever I pointed the camera at the ceiling instead of my face. Months later, Sophie asked me a question as we were clearing away Sunday lunch. "Dad?" "Yes?" If Rachel had been real, I smiled sadly. "I know." "Would you have loved her?" I thought about it for a long time. Then I answered honestly, "No." She looked surprised. "Why not?" "Because the person I loved never existed." I paused before continuing. "I loved the version of myself she made me believe I could become." Sophie reached across the table and held my hand. "You didn't need her for that." Perhaps she was right. Today, when I wake at 6:30, I still make 1 mug of tea. BBC Radio 4 still fills the kitchen. The house is still quieter than it once was, but it no longer feels empty. The photographs on the walls are different now. There are pictures of Sophie, my grandson, Mark pulling ridiculous faces during one of our walks, a group photograph from the fraud awareness volunteers, real people, real memories, real conversations. If you're watching this because someone online makes you feel wonderfully understood, I hope your story ends happily. Many do. But before you send money, before you keep a secret from your family, before you believe that urgency cannot wait another day, please stop. Talk to someone who knows you in the real world. A daughter, a son, a friend, your bank. Because genuine love is never frightened by a little time. And anyone who truly cares for you will never ask you to choose between them and the people who have loved you all your life.